Good morning. Thank you all for joining us on our webcast today. We're sponsored by Rubicon Carbon, and we're talking about super pollutants and how we can abate them to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I'm Margaret Morales. I direct the carbon program here at Trellis Group, and I'm thrilled to be hosting today, as this, I think, is an underappreciated but very important topic. So before we dive into our content, I'm going to walk you through the obligatory webinar kickoff with showing you all the bells and whistles on our platform today. This is a really fun platform because you have a lot of control over what you see. You should see a number of windows in front of you. It should look kind of like this. You can see one window with all the speaker faces, one with our slides for today. So I encourage you to make the slides a little bigger when we come to that section of the webcast. You also have the opportunity to chat with other attendees, so feel free to say something to the other attendees where you're tuning in from. And there's also a button along the bottom that allows you to ask questions to our panelists. I will reserve the last section of our webinar today for Q&A, so I encourage you, send your questions in. You can send them in throughout the conversation, and I will try to get to as many as possible. And there's another button there at the bottom of your screen that allows you to download some resources, including the slides from our presentation today. We are recording this webinar. We always record webinars, and we will send you the recording later this afternoon, and you can also access it in the future on the Trellis website. So I think that's the whirlwind tour. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box, and we have some folks who can help you if you run into problems with the platform. But with that, we're going to move ahead. I'm thrilled, before we dive into our conversation, we have Jen Jenkins on the phone. She's the Chief Science Officer at Rubicon Carbon, and she's going to extend a welcome. So Jen, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Margaret, and thanks to everyone for joining us. What I want to do is just give you a little bit of information on Rubicon and who we are, what we do, and sort of why we're here today. Rubicon is a vertically integrated carbon credit investment and management firm. And so we work to de-risk investing in climate action. And to that end, we want to scale the voluntary carbon market. A few things set us apart. One key thing is that we own the credits that we include in our portfolio. They're on our balance sheet. And that means we have to invest heavily in having a first-class science team to evaluate and grade the carbon emissions reduction and removal credits that we have in our portfolio. Today, we're really excited about this webinar because we want to help people to understand, as Margaret said, the ins and outs of these sort of fairly unappreciated super pollutant credits. And I want to just extend a huge thanks to our panelists for being here today, as well as Margaret and Trellis for organizing and sort of broadcasting this webinar. So that's it from me. Thanks again, and really looking forward to the discussion today.
All right. Thank you so much, Jen. I'm glad you could join us. All right. So let's dive in. We have three really deep subject matter experts who are with us today and will guide us through the conversation. So I'm pleased to introduce them to you. We have Donna Lee, who's the co-founder at Calyx Global, a carbon credit ratings agency. We have Stephen Porter, who's a professor of ecology at Brown University, and Amishi Claros, who is the head of industrial and CDR, carbon dioxide removal research at Rubicon Carbon. So thank you all so much for joining us. Before we dive into your presentations, I want to run a poll. And this will give us a sense of the audience and sort of what they feel like they're coming in, how much knowledge you feel like you're coming in with for our conversation today. So if you could answer this poll, that would be great, and I'll show the results live. And the question is really very straightforward. How much do you know about super pollutants or point source emission reduction credits? And you can answer a lot. You feel like you've heard a lot about this. You're coming in with a high level of knowledge. A little bit, maybe you've heard about it, but you know very little, or nothing at all, which would mean you saw the title of this webinar, you're intrigued, and you showed up. So tell us what you feel your level of knowledge is here. And then I'll show the results here in a second. All right, let me flip over, and I think we'll see them coming in live. So looks like about a third of folks feel like they're coming in with a high level of knowledge about super pollutant credits. About 2/3 of folks feeling like you've heard about this before, but are looking to learn more. And 7% brave souls who showed up with very little knowledge. And this is great because you're going to learn a lot from our experts today. So with that, I think we should dive into the presentations. And Amishi, you're going to speak first, and I'll hand it over to you. Take it away.
Awesome. Thanks. Hi, everyone. First, thanks again for joining, especially if it's like early or your lunch hour. I'm Amishi. I'm the head of industrial and CER research at Rubicon Carbon. So that just means I'm part of the science team. I do that due diligence that Jen was talking about. We really investigate the technologies and projects we're investing in because, as she said, we hold our credits. So it's really important for us to understand the risks and the values that all of the credits and projects have, so we can create like a very risk diversified, a hedged offering to our consumers. So my background actually was more in the carbon dioxide space at DOE. I invested in early TRL technologies that really looked at turning CO2 into value-added products or carbon dioxide removal. So when it came to Rubicon, there's this whole suite of projects that didn't have this TRL, this technology readiness level risk, but really we're targeting non-CO2 gases that we called super pollutants that were exhibiting a different type of risk, right? It was the deployment risk, it was accounting, it was monetization. And I've really learned a ton about these super pollutants. It's been a while, since grad school, honestly, since I've engaged with them. And just understanding how much of an impact these projects have was eye-opening. So one of the biggest things to take away from super pollutants is that they have an outsized global warming impact. So we'll call that GWP. And just for measurements, it's pretty much how much warming it's measured against CO2. So GWP is usually set to 1, and that 1 means that it's 1 molecule of CO2 over a time span. We're going to set it to 100 years, and that's the baseline we set. So we can measure and compare other emissions to that warming potential. Methane is 28 times as worse as CO2. So that's effectively saying, like, over a course of 100 years, even if these methane molecules live less, if you set that warming timeline to 100 years, that 1 molecule of methane is like the same impact as 28 molecules of CO2. That's insane. When you get to nitrous oxide, it's even worse. It's 265 times as worse. And when you get to HFCs, right, these were things that I thought of as alternatives, as solutions to CFCs, HCFCs, right? Those were things that were punching a hole in the ozone, which were terrible, but HFCs were the alternative. They are thousands of times worse depending on the chemical. And that was just mind-boggling for me to comprehend. So all of these super pollutants really have accounted for nearly half of the global warming that we're seeing in this industrial era. So they're very impactful, especially in the near term. So enter super pollutant elimination credits. So these are the things that we invest in and that you can see on the market. So a super pollutant elimination project, or an SPE project, that's what we'll call it, is structured more or less in the same way. You have a business as usual or a counterfactual scenario. And in that scenario, your super pollutant would be emitted into the atmosphere from your human activity, right? That's what would have happened. Enter your project activity, and you're abating that super pollutant from reaching the atmosphere in some manner. So for methane projects, this can look like abating or capturing the methane from agriculture, like manure lagoons or landfills, capping it, capturing the methane that comes out and burning it, using it for energy, or just even flaring it off so it doesn't hit the atmosphere as methane. Also from oil and gas, right? You can have natural gas pipelines, and you can have distribution lines, risers that go into people's homes that can be leaky, and you can address those leaks so it stops the methane from leaking there. In all of these cases, you get credit for avoiding that methane from hitting that atmosphere. And that's the credit that you can sell and monetize and get money to continue your project activity. HFC projects look a little different. HFCs are in a lot of stuff. They're used in your refrigeration systems, right? They are the things that create the cold. They can be in HVAC, they can be in ACs. And while they are the leading, the third gen of our options, they are still so bad for the environment. And as you use your processes, as you use your refrigeration systems, they get spent. So often you can just toss the refrigerator, or you can repair it or replace that fluid. And instead, it's very easy to just vent that spent fluid, right? When you open it up, it's not like a toxic plume that comes out. It's just like, poof, to the atmosphere. But each one of those molecules, right, can be thousands of times worse than a molecule of CO2. So these projects, reclamation projects in particular, get technicians to go out with equipment, gather that spent fluid, take it to a central place, reclaim it, clean it up, and put it back into the market. So you get credit for making sure that more virgin HFCs aren't being put into the market, and instead you're replacing it, getting another use cycle out of those HFCs. You can also trade them out in manufacturing. They're used for like foam insulation. So swapping that in the manufacturing process for something that has a lower GWP is also a really great project. We are also getting projects that look at destroying them altogether, right? There is no way it can reach the atmosphere if you destroy that. It's more common to see those destruction projects really coming out of ozone depleting substances. These are things that came before HFCs, the CFCs and HCFCs. Really, there's a strong push to go in and actually like find those stockpiles and catalytically burn them up, make sure they never can touch the atmosphere that way. There's a nitrous oxide abatement, really. That's an emission that comes from chemical fertilizer manufacturing. And all of these project activities are implemented in a way that creates an avoidance of those emissions being released and gives you a stream of credits to monetize on. So as I mentioned before, we really looked at the value and the risks, and I just want to leave on some of the values on what we took away when we were crafting our SPE portfolio. One of them is that SPEs are effective, reliable, and high quality, right? A lot of these pathways actually have the ICVCM badge of CCP, that high integrity label, which I think is fantastic. It goes to show there isn't that much technology risk that I talked about earlier that you can see in emerging like pathways, especially in the CDR space. You're not contending with that. These are a lot more reliable, a lot more learned. SPE projects are also effectively permanent, especially for climate impact, right? When you take that action of avoiding the emissions from hitting the atmosphere, that's effectively permanent. You can't undo that action like you can if you're maintaining a carbon stock, right? Like in a nature-based solution or like in biochar, you can't unburn that methane. So that's a wonderful thing we consider when we have to balance our risks and our values in our portfolio. These projects are good for immediate emissions reductions in your decurb strategy. I think that's really important. If you are a person or corporate that's hitting your targets, you're looking decades down the line and you got money, like CDR is where you could be moving the needle. If you are not hitting your targets today, if you are dealing with emissions right here, right now, and you need to spend money today, I think these offsets are a really good option for you, and especially when you consider they're reasonably priced. So I think all those things in concert really has led to a bit more momentum in the space. A lot more people are talking about SPEs. They're talking about engaging with these projects and buying and retiring these credits. I think that's a good time. I think I'll toss it over to you, Stephen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name's Stephen Porter. I'm at Brown University, and I don't work selling carbon credits of any kind. I'm on the other side. I am a global change scientist by training and by publications, but for the last 5 years, I've been tasked with helping Brown think through its sustainability strategy and particularly its decarbonization strategy. And in that effort, I've been forced to grapple with the question of whether and when to buy offsets and what kind of offsets to buy if we buy them. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today for a few minutes is the way that I think about them as a global change scientist, as someone who studies the carbon cycle and writes and thinks a lot about it, but also as one who is tasked with making real world decisions about what to do and when to do it for a rather large organization. So I'm going to, in a minute, I'm going to walk you through Brown's decarbonization strategy and the role that offsets play in that. But before I do, and I just put the leaf up there so you don't have to see a big picture of my face for the minute that I'm talking, I think it's really important that to say that I started out very much against the idea of using offsets at all, because I wanted to push for rapid reduction in fossil fuel consumption, and I didn't want the attractive alternative of other offsets, of other methods to win the day, because ultimately we all know that offsets can't in total make up for our emissions. They need to be more of a last resort than a first resort. And Amishi pointed to this as well. But even within the offset space, there's a huge amount of variety, as you all know, in terms of what is offered. And most organizations don't have the bandwidth to really assess the underlying fundamental biogeochemistry of the different options. And I was worried that an offset that cost $10 compared to an offset that cost $100, even if they had very different biogeochemical properties or had different time horizons or whatever, would be very difficult for the administration to sort of grapple with spending more money if they were all called carbon offsets. So in that context, I just want to throw up what Brown is doing and hold it up not as an example, but just to say, this is our approach and I'm pretty proud of it. So we set a baseline when I started as provost in 2018. Our emissions were somewhere around the order of 50,000 metric tons per year, scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And we started by the kinds of things that would lead to fossil fuel use reduction. So we did some boiler modifications. We built out a whole bunch, or signed power purchase agreements for a whole bunch of new build renewables. Whoops, somebody switched my slide back. Okay. And so that's, you see there on the left, new build Texas wind, and then new build solar in Rhode Island, which is where Brown was. In addition to our 2040 net zero goal, we had a 2025 goal of a 75% reduction. And we ran into some engineering snafus that meant that we weren't going to be able, actually engineering unexpected, whatever, challenges, and we weren't going to be able to meet our 2025 goal. And we've been spending a lot of time rebuilding our engineering approach to decarbonize and eliminate fossil fuels. But what you can see in the graph is that between 2025 and about 2030, we were going to be above our 75% reduction goal that we set for 2025. And so I came back to the administration and said, look, maybe we ought to consider carbon offsets for this bit while we continue to decarbonize our buildings. And so it's in that context, as a part of the decarbonization portfolio, that we came back to the conversation of carbon offsets. And we ultimately decided to go with chlorofluorocarbon elimination offsets for a number of reasons. The first, that Amishi mentioned already, is that they are permanent. Okay, so that's very useful, and they are very easily quantifiable. You know how much CFC you destroyed, you know how much CFC, what the CO2 equivalent of that CFC is, and so you have the opportunity to be very quantifiable and very sure that the destruction happened. We were also very interested in working with a offset provider who took the money that we gave them and didn't just use it for old projects, but actually rolled it into new projects. And we were able to find a provider that offered that guarantee that we would spend, we bought a lot of offsets. And so we said, okay, you can take some of that money and retire old offset credits from the last 2 years, but we really want you to take some of that money and roll it into new. And they agreed to do that. So that was very, very good for us. But I do also want to say that, there are still, and I hope we get into this in the Q&A, like there are still uncertainties about this. The other thing I will say is that when we restricted our offset bid, we put out an RFP for offsets, we restricted them to just these kinds of projects, just what Amishi has been calling super pollutant projects. We didn't ask for, reforestation, avoided deforestation. We didn't ask for And even within those projects, from methane to chlorofluorocarbons to hydrofluorocarbons, we found a huge variety in the quality uh, as assessed by me and the scientific team in terms of the additionality of the project, in terms of the likelihood that the project was actually reducing emissions, in terms of all of the same things that people worry about with other kinds of offsets. So while I think that these are, in general, the ones we bought are offsets that I really stand behind, I don't universally subscribe to the idea that all of them are perfect, and they do require a lot of really important vetting. And then the last thing I'll say, and Amishi mentioned this a little bit, I know that we don't have time in this webinar to talk about the implicit assumptions about the time in offsets, but I will say that in our case, one of the challenges with the chlorofluorocarbon destruction, the company that we bought from goes around and finds abandoned chlorofluorocarbons that were banned under the Montreal Protocol, but were never destroyed. So we know when they're destroyed, that time is fixed, but we actually don't know when they would have leaked to the atmosphere. And so as you consider offsets and time, right, it's very important to think about the fact that emissions reductions right now are actually more valuable than emissions reductions in the future. And so understanding when the offset is really going to keep that carbon out of the air or not is something that you have to think very carefully about. So none of that is to say that these aren't, that I don't believe in these offsets. I do. I wouldn't have bought them, or I wouldn't have argued that Brown buy them if I didn't. But I do think all of these things are things that need to be carefully thought about by a team with a lot of scientific expertise, because it is very difficult across the entire offset market and also in the specific super pollutant market to know what you're getting unless you really do look into it. So, but having said all of that, like I stand behind these, and I have to say, from a reputational risk perspective, when my students, many of whom are Sunrise Movement protesting kinds of students, come to my office and say, "What do you mean offsets? That's greenwashing." I can sit down and I can very quickly and easily walk them through the thought process, and I have never had a student walk out saying that they thought that it was a bad idea to buy these offsets after I explain it. So from a reputational risk perspective, and also just from a climate risk perspective, I do believe that these are a very reasonable thing to do if they are part of a decarbonization strategy that includes an elimination of fossil combustion as rapidly as you can afford to. So I think that's all I'm going to say, and I will pass it over to Donna.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this webinar. I love talking about this topic because I feel, as Margaret, you said, this is sort of an underappreciated part of the carbon market. And I love, Stephen, hearing your story about how you got comfortable, right, with the use of offsets and really did your due diligence to find ones that you could stand behind. So that's fantastic. I'm going to show a next slide here. So at Calyx Global, we're a carbon credit ratings agency. We have looked at over 680 projects. Of those, around 200 of them are super pollutant projects. And as you can see here, a lot of our findings really align with the things that Stephen and Amishi have already talked about, which is, in general, and it's not perfect. I think, Stephen, you hit the nail on the head when you said it's not a slam dunk, but in general, these, at this time, at this moment in the market, these tend to perform better in terms of greenhouse gas integrity. So when you look at these graphs, these are ratings for greenhouse gas integrity. At Calyx Global, we do separate out our ratings for greenhouse gas integrity compared to sustainable development impact. And I do hope we can talk about the other sort of characteristics or benefits of different types of credits, because there are trade-offs that buyers need to make. But this particular image is just our greenhouse gas integrity ratings. And indeed, these types of projects do tend to perform better. So on the left-hand side, you have waste, and waste can include landfill gas projects, manure management, manure management can be both large commercial scale as well as household scale. These are in developing countries where households might use manure for clean cooking. On the industrial side, we look at everything from ODS destruction, ozone depleting substances, destruction, HFCs, nitric acid, adipic acid, N2O, like destroying the N2O in those types of plants. So a real range of super pollutant projects. What's interesting is that you can see the real clear difference, right, between the projects on the left and everything else. So everything else is renewable energy, forestry, cook stoves, a range of different project types. I think Amishi and Stephen have already covered, like, why is it? Like, why is it that we see such differences in the distribution of the ratings? One of the things that they mentioned, I'll just mention quickly again, is that it's easier to measure. These are, as Jen said at the beginning, they're point source emissions. So if you think about emissions that occur from land use or forestry, these emissions occur over an entire landscape. And so when you're measuring things like biomass change across a highly variable, diverse landscape, that's much harder to do than a point source when you're measuring a container of a gas and you're putting it on a scale, or the throughput of methane through a pipe that's coming out of a landfill. So these things are just kind of, they have these natural characteristics that make them a little bit of an easier fit for carbon markets. As Amishi and Stephen also said, there's not a non-permanence issue. The other thing is that also they're often highly additional. So additionality is easier to prove because oftentimes it costs money to actually destroy or try to avoid these emissions from going to the atmosphere. They don't sort of make money. And so for these reasons, they do tend to be a little bit of an easier fit. I will say, however, that many of the project types on the right-hand side, while the quality today looks poor on average, what I see is that these are changing. There is a second generation of projects that are nature-based, community-based, household-based, and I think that these distributions are going to change over time. It's just at this point in the market, we do see a higher quality for the super pollutants.
Okay, Donna, I'm going to help kind of facilitate this, the questions here right now as Margaret is rejoining. We did see from Paul, he's asking, how do you see orphaned oil and gas wells fitting into this mix? Do you have an answer for us?
Yeah, so that's one of the project types that we rate. And I think that there's a real opportunity. There are so many of these orphaned wells where there's no solvent owner and they're leaking methane. And so there's a real, especially in the United States at this time, there are a lot of these orphaned wells where there's an opportunity there for the carbon markets. I think from our view, it's really important to look at the assumptions about how much would leak out of that well, as well as there are some subsidies from the Inflation Reduction Act that can come to play. So there are some things, as Stephen said, you have to look at every single project individually to really assess the quality. But I think there's a real potential there for those particular project types.
Great, thank you. Also, somebody was asking, Shira was asking, why the names Ugly Ducklings and Swan?
So I'll take that one, but I'd love for Stephen and Amishi also to jump in. We do call them ugly ducklings at Calyx Global, in part because we feel like they are underappreciated. They are not charismatic. I have this feeling that a lot of folks really want to buy nature-based projects or community-based projects. And I get that. There's something visceral about nature. I love nature. I actually spent the last 20 years working on tropical forest conservation. It's very highly, charismatic megafauna, right? We talk about. And so these nature-based projects, I think, are very attractive. It's easier to talk about. So they make beautiful photos in a sustainability brochure. It's very difficult to get a beautiful photo of a nitric acid plant, right? Or of a ozone ODS destruction facility. So in some ways, they just don't have that charisma, but they can make great great offsets, ones that you can stand behind, as Stephen said.
I'll just add in, I think you absolutely nailed it, right? Like I balance between CDR, which I think is such a hot topic. Everyone wants to talk about it. It's really exciting and new, cutting edge science. And then you have SPE projects that the technology's been around, right? There's other challenges. It's like getting money out into these people's hands and doing it right. That's the challenge. There isn't like something new to overcome per se. And I think that charisma is also lost in these projects, right? You like focus in on this gray industrial backdrop. And for me, it was like this big shift away from like, yes, I need to get my brain out of like, who's doing these projects? It's trash, it's like manure. It's not like typically where I'd want to like, invest all my time researching into like focusing on the gas itself. And that's where I figured like there's a much more impactful storyline when you're talking about methane in general, right? The impacts of methane can be quantified, and I think put in a more global language that people can relate to.
So let's see. I have a couple questions. We're getting phenomenal questions in the chat, and I know you've been answering a few, but I want to ask you all a few questions, and then I'll return to the audience Q&A. So Stephen, I have one for you. I thought what you said about speaking to students and sort of educating them on these credits was really interesting. And so I'm curious, what are your thoughts on how well these credits are understood, and what have your internal conversations been like as you talk about these with colleagues at Brown?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say that in general, the people who don't live in the carbon markets, and so everyone on this call presumably lives a little bit in the carbon markets, or they wouldn't be on this call. But in general, there is no distinction between the types of offsets that are out there on the part of the students or the faculty at Brown if they're not in the carbon space. They view offsets either as an interesting financial instrument, and they're interested in business, and so they think it's kind of interesting because it might help. But by and large, they think that it's greenwashing and it's kind of a scam and a way for corporations to avoid doing what they should be doing, which is reducing emissions. And in fact, we had a whole conference on carbon offsets for our community that included Jen Jenkins as well as others to talk about what it is and what it isn't, and how one might think about offsets in a more nuanced way. But I would say that conversation is largely absent both from the popular press coverage, where offsets are often all lumped together, but also I would say, maybe as a result of the popular press, like in my community. And I would say that it's not particularly surprising to me that the nuance is lost given the complexity. So when you talk about something like using electricity to pull CO2 out of the air and store it underground, and compare that to potentially avoiding deforestation in a place where you're measuring statistically that deforestation is or isn't lower, to somebody who's running a pipe out of a landfill, to somebody else who's taking a bunch of cow manure, generating extra methane by adding food waste, and then capturing some of that methane and selling it without knowing what the counterfactual is vis-a-vis, like that's really complicated stuff, right? And so it all gets lumped under offsets, and that's the public perception. And I think one of the challenges for the carbon markets moving forward for these kind of offsets and every other is to figure out how to de-risk it. And I know that's what Rubicon is working on, but I mean de-risk in multiple categories. So the most important risk to me is that the offset doesn't actually deliver the climate benefit that it says it does. And right, that is to me, as someone who spends their life working on climate solutions, that's the biggest risk. But there's other kinds of risks, like public perception, like what does the rating agency do, like what is the time value of carbon? There's all these sort of scientific uncertainties, right? And all of those risks have to be quantified in some way. So Donna, I really like Donna's like rating chart of the different offsets. But my first question, of course, for her is like, okay, well, let's get into the nitty gritty of how you did those ratings, right? And so I think we're at a better place than we were a few years ago. When Brown was considering this, there were projects that were bid into us that had no scientific merit whatsoever, right? I think that's less likely to happen now, but we haven't actually gone back out onto the market. So I'll defer to my Rubicon friends to tell me if that's true. But anyway, so that's a bit of where I think the public is. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, that was great. And I'd like to dive in a little more. Donna, when you were speaking, you said buyers have to make trade-offs when they buy credits. And I think that's a little bit of what Stephen is getting at. All these credits have different attributes. So can you speak for a minute about how you see that with super pollutant credits?
Yeah, so first of all, Stephen, I would love to get into the details about our ratings. I love diving into the rabbit holes with folks. But I think you said something that's really true, which is all credits have risks. And to your question, Margaret, they have both risks and benefits. So I think we've been talking a lot about the greenhouse gas integrity risks. And I think it's great, Stephen, that that's your number one priority because you're offsetting, right? You're making a claim against your university's emissions. And I think that's really important. So some of the trade-offs that I've seen that have been really difficult for companies is when companies might have other goals that they're layering on to these credits. So sometimes they have goals related to protecting biodiversity, to improving water resources. They want to ensure that they're benefiting communities because they have an environmental justice element as part of their climate action. They want to ensure that part of their money is being spent to improve the lives of vulnerable people who didn't cause the problem to start with. So this can get you talk about the complexities of understanding the technicalities of measuring things like oxidation factors with different landfill covers. You layer onto that all these other goals that a organization might have, and then you look at credits and all their different attributes, and you end up with these trade-offs and understanding what's my risk on the greenhouse gas side, while I also want to achieve some of these other benefits. And I think one of the real challenges, if you looked at our charts, is that some of the project types that do actually generate some of the highest levels of what we consider sustainable development impact. So we do have ratings for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, the impact and the contributions. There's almost a trade-off where the higher the SDG impact in today's market, I hope this changes, but in today's market, you see a lot of those project types that deliver a lot of really wonderful other benefits sometimes are more challenged to get the measurement right, to prove additionality. They might not be as durable. So I think I see those trade-offs being made every day by companies that we talk to, and they're tough. I think they're really difficult.
Might I jump in with one response to Donna, because I think it's really pertinent. I know you want another question, and it's okay if you say no and you want to move on, Margaret. I'll leave it to you. But I do have
Stephen, go for it.
Okay. So just to give a really concrete example of the exact thing that Donna was talking about, we had projects bid into us for our offsets that included a very low price, very, very high quality, super easy to prove additionality methane destruction project that at a place that had a lot of labor violations and violated actually our policy for contracting with certain organizations who have a certain set of labor problems. We also had confined animal feeding operation methane destruction project, so the same gas bid in, at the same time as our sustainability plan called for a reduction in red meat consumption as a way of addressing our scope 3 emissions, right? So it seemed weird to buy carbon offsets to help subsidize a confined feeding operation that was producing beef that we were trying not to buy because of the high carbon footprint of beef. And then we had another kind of methane destruction bid in where the people were not able to actually even quantify the counterfactual in any way, right? And those had very different prices. So the one that was the least expensive had the most labor problems. The one that was the most expensive was the one that was supporting the beef production at a confined feeding operation. And we had to sit down and say, like, okay, so carbon reduction is a major value that we want to do, but it's not the only value. How do we do that? How do we think about that trade-off? So just as a concrete example, even just within the methane destruction space.
Thanks, Stephen. That's fascinating. And I think none of this is simple. None of this is straightforward. It takes a lot of thought and analysis. Let me ask one more question, then we'll turn to audience questions. And Amishi, it's for you. I want to play the skeptic with you for a second. You showed us the chart that shows how potent these gases really are. And so I'm curious, why are we asking a voluntary system, a voluntary carbon market to abate these? Why is there not regulation on the industries that emit these to abate them and take care of them?
Yeah, and I feel like that's probably the toughest question out there, right? Like this is something we grapple with. Like, couldn't this be insetting? Why can't governments just step up to the plate? And I think in the last couple weeks alone, I think we are getting a prime example in the US on how finicky sometimes expecting governments to step up to a plate can be. Speaking from past experience, right? Government also needs a whole spectrum of things before it can enforce, right? It needs measurements, it needs an infrastructure, it needs like resources, right? And I feel like a lot of the projects that we invest in are these really high impact underfunded areas that there is a little bit of momentum, but it hasn't been enough to translate change. And what I see the VCM as is really, I think, Stephen, you called it, some people view it as a really cool finance tool. It is an extremely effective way to move corporate finance, corporate dollars into the hands of people that are effectively making change in almost like a frictionless space. So while you are seeing things like the global methane pledge, you are seeing other efforts, to address emissions from cooling, in particular HFCs, and you're seeing the Montreal Protocol and the Kilgagi Amendment. They're still in terms of quantified impacts, they're just now starting to get like dollars translated into actions, right? Like even with the global methane pledge, which was like, I believe 150 countries signing on to it, 2% of global climate finance is dedicated towards methane. That's not enough. So I think there's a lot of potential for these to effectively come up in global regulations or in domestic regulations. And I do believe they can be enforced, especially when you can include them in NDCs. But I think there's a bridge before we get there. And I think a really effective bridge is the VCM in particular for like figuring out issues with additionality, figuring out issues with, what it takes to deploy these technologies. And I just think it's a really adaptive mechanism that responds very quickly to in particular criticisms that we've seen in the past, right? So I think that market value that it has is really helpful in this bridging space in my mind.
All right, that's a really powerful theory of change for what we are trying to do with the voluntary carbon market. So, okay, I'm going to move on to some of our audience questions. And we got one here from Reed Calhoun. The question is, super pollutant projects often generate their emission reduction impacts immediately. And if you hold quality and permanence constant, should a ton removed or reduced today be more valuable than that same ton if we reduce or remove it tomorrow? And how do you balance those things? How much more valuable is it to act today versus tomorrow? Amishi, how do you think about this question?
Oh, that's tough. Because I do removals, right? So I have to like removals and I have to like avoidance credits that are the SPEs. And I think that discount value is very important to consider. Like $1 today will be more impactful based off the discount value of the dollar tomorrow. But I think it also lies on the corporate that is offsetting. I think offsets in how Stephen used them are really helpful for SPEs, right? You're looking to hit and abate a goal that you're not quite hitting in the near term. If you can have a forward-looking mindset, removals make a lot more sense because you can be moving the needle and creating a market that needs to be there in the future. So I think it's the discount value of your of your dollar as well, but I think it's also the mindset in which you approach your decarbonization portfolio. Ideally, you have a nice blend. We have a slide I didn't include it. You have a nice blend of offsets that can tackle the whole suite. You can have, you know, immediate ones and a small amount of removals that go into a larger built portion of your portfolio into the future. So I think that it's a balance that you have to strike.
I actually am going to disagree a little bit with Amishi on that, if that's okay. We're allowed to have a robust discussion.
Yeah.
So from a climate perspective, a ton today is better than a ton in the future, unequivocally, for several reasons. One, that ton today will stay there next year also, and it's cumulative amounts of emissions that matter. Also, given the nonlinearity in the system, potential with biophysical feedbacks in the Earth system, for example, melting of permafrost, staying lower, warming sooner buys us time. Now, from a development of new technology, so Amishi mentioned, I think, carbon dioxide removal, that's a whole other webinar. But you know, if you are interested in investing in things that will play out over time and develop new technologies that can help in the future, that's certainly a way of balancing your portfolio in the way that Amishi mentioned. But from a pure global warming, how much is going to happen? A ton today, removing a ton or keeping a ton out of the atmosphere today is more valuable than removing it in 10 years, for sure. As a climate person, I would say that.
All right, thank you. I love to hear the different perspectives. And I think this idea of there are multiple ways to act is the beauty of the carbon market. I'm going to move to you next, Donna. We got a question from Kyle. What would you say to the large segment of the carbon market that are kind of removals only, removal pursuit? How would you talk about these credits to them?
I think that's a really great question, and I'm also curious what Amishi and Stephen think about it too. But from our perspective at Calyx Global, it's better to buy high quality than it is necessarily to distinguish between reducing emissions or avoiding emissions and capturing, because in some ways the atmospheric math is the same, right? If you reduce emissions today, that's less that you have to remove later. And we're just not at the point, if you look at atmospheric emissions and how much we emit, it's that bathtub analogy, right? Turning off the tap is just as good as like pulling something out, water out of the bathtub. And so what we really, at this point in time, advise is look for high quality, look for that unimpeachable ton, as Stephen, it sounds like you have done, right? You look at all the different aspects to be able to convince your students and other professors that, yes, this is worth purchasing because it will have an impact on the atmosphere. So from my perspective, I really appreciate those companies who are willing to spend $500 a ton to invest in a technology, as Bill Gates would say, pay down the green premium, because we will need to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere at some point in time. So I think, more power to them. I don't think that's available for a lot of companies, and I think you can do just as much good by ensuring that you're just buying high quality. And these types of credits are ones that, at this point in time in the market, as we've shown, can be higher quality. They tend to be higher quality at this time.
I completely agree. I think that the only thing I would like to add to that is that removals versus avoidance come with different sets of burdens of proof, right? Yeah. And so you have to think through very carefully. But if you are 100% sure that you avoided a ton, that is exactly the same as 100% sure that you removed a ton. It's the question of how you get to 100% sure that differs a little bit between the two, and therefore requires a lot of due diligence.
I'll second that. As someone that has to straddle both, yes, 100%, Stephen.
All right, I think this is a really good follow-on question to that. And Amishi, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Who's the typical buyer of a super pollutant emission credit?
Yeah, that's a good one. So I might reference just like publicly available information. One is actually this like kind of brand of, I feel like, very high profile, prestigious colleges, right? Brown, obviously, I think Duke put out a really good paper in which they talked about the credits they retired to, and they were in a similar place as Brown, right? They set goals, I think, that were inclusive of scope 3, which are very hard to abate. So therefore, they required a retirement of a large amount of offsets, and those offsets included methane, for example. It was a suite, it was more of a portfolio approach, but they had many SPE credits in there. Another one is Harvard Business School. I think they've offset, I think, air travel, and they've used, I believe, Calyx to help to rate. Yeah, I feel like this worked out so well. I'm like pulling all the threads together right now. To rate A-rated these high integrity projects. I think we've also seen interest in people that are within the same realm, right? Like if you're a food company, to be more interested in projects that tackle agricultural methane. I think we're seeing some of those, and we're also seeing regionality. Often since it's a better price point than say others, especially in particular CDR. If you have folks or companies that are located in a particular area, they're interested in getting projects that are from that same regionality. And oftentimes you can, you don't need to have a forest particularly there. You can get landfill credits, you can generate SPE credits from, a lot more diverse areas, including the global south, which is a huge benefit for us when we're looking at, credits to pursue.
All right, thank you. Another one for you, Amishi. We got a question about black carbon. Could you touch on that for a second? What is that?
Yeah, that's okay. So that's like particulate matter that can come out of like diesel combustion. It can come out of coal. It has local and global impacts as well. I believe cook stoves, and Donna, please correct me if I'm wrong, cook stoves also have a component of reducing black carbon. That's where you're creating a different, you're either having an improved cook stove system, or you're having a cook stove that uses a completely alternative fuel. So you're not using dung or charcoal, perhaps. So there are projects that can directly address the black carbon that is created from like partial or incomplete combustion processes. Donna, did you want to add, or Stephen?
Maybe I'll just add that I haven't yet seen the impacts of black carbon or any other what we would call biogeophysical aspects versus biogeochemical enter into sort of this calculation for claiming emission reductions in the voluntary carbon market. However, I do think these biogeophysical impacts, things like albedo, black carbon, et cetera, are interesting. And at some point, maybe in the maturity of the market, we'll see more of these types of impacts considered. Because I do think that they can have both a cooling and warming effect. What it means is that when you have projects that do reduce black carbon, so we have looked at a couple of these project types, we feel like the calculation is more conservative because they are not including the impacts of black carbon. So it's an interesting question. It's just I don't think the market has quite gotten there, although recently somebody sent me an email. There is one organization that is looking at some of these biogeophysical impacts. So the market's always improving, becoming more sophisticated.
All right, thank you so much. I want to give you each a chance to have some parting words here for our audience. So if you could each share sort of what's the one idea that you'd love to leave people with. And Stephen, could you start?
Oh, I was really hoping you weren't going to ask me first, but okay. So I think that the message I want to have is one that came up in the conversation of the good photo op versus the ugly duckling versus the swan. And I would just say that there are a lot of offsets in the world, in my opinion, for which there are great photo ops and absolutely no scientific basis for the claim being made. And I also think that there are a lot of things that are not particularly good for your sustainability for sure, that actually do an enormous amount of good to help fight the warming problem. And many of these so-called super pollutant offsets fall in that category. So I really appreciated, that wasn't my idea, the ugly ducklings and swans, that was Donna's idea, and I hadn't actually seen it before, but I think it's very well phrased, because I would encourage buyers not to be seduced by the good photo op, and to make sure that the thing that they're buying is achieving the actual goal that they want to achieve, and that the scientific consensus about that is extremely robust. And that may not be the prettiest project, but it is the one that will ultimately, if your goal is to reduce the level of warming that we experience over our lifetimes and into the future, that goal should be paramount, and the photo op should probably be something that you can live without. So maybe that's mine.
All right, thanks. What about you, Donna? Parting words?
Yeah, Stephen took mine, but maybe I'll just add to that and say, give them a look. Like, they might not have been the first thing that you were drawn to when you think about wanting to buy a credit, but give them a chance. Like, take a look. And the fact is, if you look at all the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, scenarios of how we avoid dangerous climate change, we do not get there without tackling these industrial emissions. So take a second look, or first look if you haven't looked at them yet.
All right, thanks. Amishi, bring us home. What are your parting thoughts?
I guess it would be following along to care about super pollutants. If caring for you is purchasing credits, like, that's great, but I think it's just more awareness of how impactful these near-term climate forcers can be as we get to tipping points is incredible. And I think a bigger demand from a collective group saying that we need more action can move the needle on so many things, whether it's, NDCs or like global monitoring, or getting more information out about information transparency from industries. And obviously the science that Stephen was talking about, all of that will effectively improve, and I think get us closer to a place where we're effectively dealing with super pollutants through like a myriad of ways, including these VCM projects as well. So I think just getting more people to care about these things, I think will move the needle.
All right, thank you all so much. That's the time we have today. So thank you to our audience for joining and bearing with us in the joy of getting to be together live. And thank you to our three panelists. This was fascinating and information-packed. So if anyone wants to look at the slides in the future, you can download them here in the on the platform. And we will be posting this recording as well on the Trellis website, and you can reference it in the future. So thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you in future webinars. Have a great afternoon.